Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Martinez with Natural Plant Products out in Portland, Oregon, where, like most of the country, we are experiencing some very oddly snowy weather. Thank you for joining us today for climate change, what it is, and what can the oilseed industry do about it. Today's webinar will be presented by Alan Payne. Alan was born in England and studied chemical engineering at the University of Surrey in Guildford. In 1984, he joined the Rosedowns Company, which is now part of the De Smet Balestra Group. In his career, Alan has taken on various roles, mainly associated with vegetable oil refining, including 5 years here in the US, working for De Smet in their Atlanta, Georgia office. Today, he lives back in England and has recently retired from working as global technical support on behalf of De Smet Balestra's office in Brussels, Belgium. He's a regular contributor to the AOCS Inform Connect forum and has been heavily involved in this year's annual meeting. Away from work, Alan's interests include amateur theater, music, and writing. Together with a group of 8 other writers, he has brought out a collection of linked science fiction stories available online as an ebook or paperback. During today's session, please write any questions for our presenter into the questions section of your control panel. All questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the presentation. Thanks again for joining us. With that, I'll turn it over to Alan.
Thanks very much, Mike. I hope you can all see the slide, the first slide of this presentation. Hopefully it's all up there and someone shout out if it isn't. Now, you might think it's a bit strange we're going to be talking about global warming when in fact the United States and parts of Europe have been swept by snow and ice, but we shall come to that. Much of my career has been involved with the design of edible oil refining equipment. At the same time, I have been following the debate about global warming and trying to understand some of the issues around this controversial subject. Climate change is very complicated, as illustrated by this image from Pixabay, which is quite a useful source of free pictures. Of course, it would be impossible in a short talk to cover this whole subject in detail. So I'm going to divide this presentation into 3 sections, covering the basic science behind why and how we believe the world is getting warmer, what the oil processing industry can do to reduce its own footprint and save energy in an economical and sustainable way, and the role that biofuels can play in replacing petroleum-based products. But I hope that you will find the general principles I'm going to talk about interesting, even if you're not involved in the vegetable oil industry. So what's all the fuss about, and how do we know what's going on? In parts of the Arctic and Antarctic, winter snowfall does not fully melt in the summer and turns to ice, trapping air bubbles with it. Hardy scientists, well, rather them than me, have drilled down into the ice, extracting long cylindrical cores, and then analysed the air bubbles to see how much carbon dioxide was in the air at the time. And the result is fairly surprising. By carefully counting the annual layers of ice, the oldest cores have been dated to 803,719 years before the Common Era. For most of that time until now, the level of carbon dioxide has varied between 200 and 250 parts per million, until in the Industrial Revolution, the graph starts a near vertical rise, passing 300 parts per million in 1910 for the first time in over 800,000 years. We have now reached over 400 parts per million and are heading for double the long-term average. Hundreds of years ago, fossil fuel use was very small, and it only started to rise off the bottom of the graph in about 1850. Carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel use have risen by about 100 times since then, reaching 36 billion tonnes in 2018. The current pandemic has led to a fall in emissions, but only by 6.4% in 2020, according to the journal Nature. So why is the amount of carbon dioxide in the air anything to worry about? The answer is that there is a close link between world temperature and the amount of CO2. And if the level today is exceptionally high, then we can expect that to lead to exceptionally high temperatures. Oxygen mostly consists of two types or isotopes, oxygen-16 and oxygen-18. Water containing oxygen-18 is heavier than water containing oxygen-16, and the heavier type is more likely to precipitate out of clouds the colder it is. Therefore, when it was colder, the Antarctic snow contained more oxygen-18 than when it was warmer. We can use this data to show how the temperature has varied over the past 800,000 years. And we can see there is a remarkable correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide, shown by the blue line, and the temperature in the Antarctic, shown in red. Outside the polar regions, there are other methods that can be used to determine what the temperature was in the past, including the ratio of oxygen-16 and 18 in seashells, pollen deposits showing what types of plant are growing in a particular time and place, and variations in tree rings. Putting archaeological evidence together with historical records, we can get an idea of what has happened over the last 1,000 years. The graph shows a steady level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, indicated by the blue line, from the year 1000 until about 1850, when it began a steep rise. Global temperature, indicated by the red line, has stayed close to 13.7 degrees Celsius from 1000 up until about 1900, when it too started rising steeply, reaching 14.4 degrees Celsius by the year 2000. It has continued to rise, and the last decade has been the hottest ever recorded. Why do we have to worry about a rise of only around 1 degree Celsius? It doesn't sound like very much. One of the problems is that the distribution of that rise has not been even, which has caused some northern polar regions to gain more than 2 degrees Celsius in only the past 50 years. Even more alarming is that extreme weather events are becoming more common. One investigation into natural disasters showed that weather-linked events such as storms, floods, droughts, and wildfires increased by 3 times just between 1980 and 2015. And this also relates to extreme winter weather, because if there's more moisture in the atmosphere, there's more energy in the atmosphere, this can lead to more extreme winter storms, as well as hurricanes and droughts. We can't be sure exactly what will happen in the future, but a study by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, indicates that if temperature trends are allowed to continue, then by the end of the 21st century, not only temperatures will change, but the world will experience dramatic shifts in rainfall patterns. The scale here is inches of water per year. So this is minus 20 inches of water, which is more than half a meter. And in some parts of the world, that could happen and lead to great problems in food production. We're also at risk of sea level rises, affecting many populated areas that currently lie very close to the coast. A question we need to ask is, how do we know that rising levels of carbon dioxide are causing rising temperatures and not the other way round? An important clue is that the extra carbon dioxide contains very little radioactive carbon-14, which is the basis of radioactive carbon dating. The half-life of carbon-14 is 5,030 years, so that fossil fuels, 5,730 years, so that fossil fuels which have been under the ground for millions of years contain hardly any, but biologically derived carbon in the sea contains a significant amount. This diagram shows a simplified view of a global carbon balance. It's important to note that these flows are in gigatons or billions of metric tons per year of carbon, not carbon dioxide, which weighs 3.7 times as much. About half of the 9.5 gigatons released from fossil fuel use stays in the air. Some is dissolved into the ocean, and some is incorporated into land and vegetation. An encouraging sign is that higher levels of carbon dioxide seem to be stimulating plant growth, but not enough to offset the increase. The UK and a number of other countries and organisations have declared the goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 or a similar date in order to keep the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels below 450 parts per million and the global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius, as required by the Paris Accord. But it's a big job, and we not only have to deal with current emissions, but also in the rise in emissions that will take place if we do nothing. Increasing population and increasing demand per person as poorer countries develop mean that by 2050, people could be putting 40% more carbon dioxide into the air than at present unless we do something about it. And this adds up to about 50 gigatons per year of carbon dioxide, compared with the current figure of around 35 gigatons per year. In an article in the Chemical Engineer in September 2014, Jeff Maitland, Professor of Energy Engineering at Imperial College London, sets out a clear and practical way to reduce emissions by 50 gigatons per year. Stopping the use of fossil fuels in such a short time is not possible, and he proposes 3 broad steps. Half the required reduction, or 25 gigatons a year, could be achieved by using energy more efficiently and the increased use of natural gas in place of fuels like coal. 15 gigatons could be saved by the use of renewable energy and nuclear power. But even after we've done all of that, we would still have to capture 10 billion tons per year of carbon dioxide in situations such as coal-fired power stations, liquefy it, and store it underground. And this is a very large amount of carbon capture and storage. Maitland reckons it would take about 3,500 full-scale units to do this. And currently, the world rate of carbon capture and storage is around 40 million tons. So we still have a very long way to go on that one. So it's easier said than done. And although I hope we're not in quite such a desperate situation as the people on the Titanic, it's going to be a huge task to make a substantial reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, let alone bring them to zero. All parts of the economy are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, and no one sector is outstandingly bad. So it's important for all areas to do what they can to be more efficient. So what can we do about climate change in the vegetable oil industry? Agriculture is a very competitive business, and farmers are always aiming to save energy and reduce fertilizer use, which is also a source of greenhouse gas. Increasing numbers of farmers are using sophisticated technology, including satellite tracking, to improve efficiency. In the right circumstances, oil palms can help to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, in spite of the bad press that palm oil often gets. In oil processing, there have been very impressive energy savings over the last few decades, but there is still more that can be done. And vegetable oils are also playing a role in producing renewable biofuels. In many sectors, including the vegetable oil industry, we've seen huge savings in energy over the years that have been driven purely by economics and not by any desire to save the planet. And in the future, there are still more things we can do to improve efficiency and save money, whether we believe in climate change or not. I'm now going to change the focus and look very specifically at some issues in edible oil refining, which happens to be my speciality. If you're working in other areas, you will probably be able to find similar ways in which emissions can be reduced. Even if you think you're doing everything possible to save energy, it is likely in the future that energy will become more expensive, making it easier to justify spending more on efficiency. Deodorizing vegetable oil uses a lot of energy in refineries. The oil has to be heated up to a temperature of around 250 degrees Celsius and also exposed to a low pressure of a few millibar while having steam bubbled through it. The picture shows the so-called barometric vacuum system used for maintaining a low pressure inside the deodorizer. It is the cheapest one to buy and widely used in spite of being expensive to run and highly polluting. The vacuum skimming pond is a familiar sight in many refineries. Fatty matter in the dirty water circulating in a vacuum set is allowed to float to the surface where it can hopefully be skimmed off. But even the most efficient skimming systems leave a significant amount of organic matter in the water, which gives off a bad smell as it passes through the cooling tower. Cooling towers with their large fans are very efficient at spreading odours over a wide range, and it's often possible to smell a refinery kilometres away if it is using this type of system. The large amount of land used by the skimming pond is often quite large, and in some refineries is taking up space that could be used for more productive purposes. The large pumps required to circulate the water and the energy required by the fans only add to the inefficiency of a system. Using chilled water reduces the pressure in the main condenser, which reduces the steam requirement of the ejectors by about 2/3. The condenser water circulates through plate heat exchangers, these items here in blue, where glycol water at 0 to 5 degrees Celsius cools the circulating water in the condenser to 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. There are two heat exchangers for cooling the circulating water so that one can be cleaned while the other is in use. Some electricity is required to refrigerate the water, but the energy is small compared with the steam saved. Chilled water vacuum systems use standard packaged water chillers and plate heat exchangers, so the extra capital cost compared with the traditional system is not very high, and payback times of around a year are possible. So it's not only good for climate change, but also good for the bottom line. An additional benefit of the chilled water vacuum system is that excess water, or the effluent shown here, which is slightly contaminated with fatty matter, overflows continuously, and is much easier to manage than recovering the fatty matter from a dirty water stream that is circulating through a cooling tower. The fatty matter is emulsified into the water using sodium or potassium hydroxide. The settling pond is no longer required, effluent costs are reduced, and the smell is easily contained. The steam requirement for vacuum ejectors can be reduced further by freezing the vapour before it reaches the ejector set. The vapour passes through heat exchangers called sublimators or dry condensers, which are cooled by liquid ammonia at -30 degrees Celsius. Only a small amount of water vapour and air passes through. The steam consumption of the ejector set is therefore much less than with other systems, and although some electricity is required for the refrigeration, the overall energy cost is well below other options, unless steam is very cheap compared with the cost of electricity. There are several sublimators designs available, which can be either vertical or horizontal as shown in the picture. If we look at the overall energy consumption of a typical 1,000 ton per day palm oil deodorizer, we can see that refrigerated vacuum systems use a lot less energy than the traditional barometric arrangement, and this doesn't take into account further savings in the cooling system. The orange bar shows the deodorizer injection steam for steam used for the vacuum equipment, and the electric power, if any, required for refrigeration. Chilled water vacuum systems use less than half the deodorizing and vacuum energy of the old system. And the energy used by deodorizer with sublimators is only about 12% of a classic system shown here. Sublimator systems are relatively expensive and can take years to get a return on investment. They're not suitable for very small refineries, but as the technology develops and energy becomes more expensive, as it probably will, then sublimators will become suitable for a wider range of situations. Now, while it's been possible to reduce the energy required for vacuum systems, we see it coming down here, this is the orange bit, the heating energy represented by the blue bar here has not been reduced to the same extent. When using sublimators, the energy required for heating the oil is far more than the deodorizing and vacuum energy. Now, in this example, about 75% of the energy required to heat the incoming oil has been provided by the outgoing oil, which sounds fairly good, but it's still possible to do better. In this example, soybean oil is heated from 100 degrees Celsius to 15 degrees Celsius by a heat recovery section heated by deodorized oil at 250 degrees. The rest of the heating is achieved using high pressure steam heated by 2.5 kilograms of fuel oil per ton of soybean oil. The oil leaving the deodorizer is at 135 degrees Celsius, and this can be used elsewhere in the refinery, such as heating oil entering the neutralizing line or boiler feed water. But in some refineries, it is possible to generate more low-grade heat than can be easily used, and it can be difficult to exchange heat between different sections of the plant if they're not very close to each other. One way to improve the heat recovery of the deodorizer and reduce the energy consumption of a high-pressure steam boiler is to add an extra heat recovery vessel. There might not be room to install any additional equipment near the existing deodorizer, but an additional heat recovery vessel can be installed in any convenient location if the oil is pumped to it using a sealless pump. In the example shown here, the new vessel has the same heat transfer area as the existing deodorizer. The fuel consumption is reduced from 2.5 to 1.6 kilograms of fuel per ton of oil, and the outgoing oil at 120 degrees Celsius can still be used for low temperature heating if required. At a fuel cost of 50 cents per kilogram, there will be a saving of $75,000 per year. On this basis, it would probably take a few years to pay back the investment, but after that, maintenance costs would be very low and the savings would continue for many years. And if your current fuel consumption is a lot higher than 2.5 kilograms of fuel oil per ton, which is about 3 normal cubic meters per ton of natural gas, then your energy savings could be a lot higher by installing something like this. Even if you can't afford a new investment right now, it's still possible to reduce emissions and save money by monitoring the operation of existing equipment. A small change in the temperature profile of the deodorizer can have a large effect on the running cost. If the oil is heated to 215 degrees Celsius in the heat recovery section of the deodorizer, and then heated using light fuel oil to 250 degrees Celsius in the final heating section, then this will require 2.5 kilograms of fuel per ton of oil, as we saw earlier. But if the bleached oil at the heat recovery section falls to 210 degrees Celsius, which is a small change and easy to overlook, then the fuel consumption rises to 2.9 kilograms per ton, which could cost over $30,000 per year. One more thing I'd like to say about deodorizer efficiency is that it's important to measure the steam distribution correctly. Odors and other impurities are removed from the oil by bubbling steam through the oil at high temperature and low pressure. But a certain amount of steam is also required to agitate oil in parts of the deodorizer that are well below the deodorizing temperature. In heat transfer compartments, we need agitation to get a good level of heat transfer, but not much deodorization takes place here because of the relatively low oil temperature. The distribution of steam depends on the design, but as an example, on the left we have a deodorizer using 8 kilograms per ton of steam in the deodorizing compartments and 3 kilograms per ton everywhere else in the vessel. But if the unit is not controlled properly and there are 4 kilograms per ton entering the non-deodorizing compartments, then we can only put 7 kilograms per ton in the deodorizing trays, which reduces the deodorizing capacity by 14%. The vacuum set continues to use the same amount of energy as before, and the overall efficiency of the plant falls. Renewable energy, including wind, solar, and fuels from biological sources, have been gaining popularity as ways of avoiding the release of greenhouse gases into the air. These methods are not necessarily totally carbon-free. Wind and solar farms have an energy cost for building them in the first place, and if we're going to make fuel from agricultural products, we have to make sure we're doing it with low greenhouse gas emissions. It's no good cutting down a forest to create a fuel plantation, and we have to make biofuels in a way that does not create fuel at the expense of essential food. Low carbon energy from sources such as wind, solar, hydroelectric, and nuclear can be used in industry, homes, and electric cars to replace fossil fuels and also make hydrogen that can be used as a fuel. But in areas of freight transportation and air transport, hydrogen or electricity are impractical, and we will probably still have to use fossil fuels or liquid fuels from renewable sources for some time to come. Vegetable oil seems like an obvious choice to replace the oil that comes out of the ground, but it's not as easy as it first looks. The world production of vegetable oil is around 200 million tons per year, and animal fats only add another 30 million tons per year. But global production of petroleum is over 4 billion tons per year, and coal, including lignite, comes in at 8 billion tons. Air travel in particular has taken a dramatic downturn in the past year, but in a normal year uses about 300 million tons of fuel, with heavy trucks and ships each using a similar amount. The use of vegetable oil to make industrial chemicals and plastics is also being proposed, so it's not hard to imagine that sometime in the future a demand for fuels from biological sources exceeding 1 billion tons per year, which is a very big number compared to what is now being achieved. Fortunately, there are other ways to make these fuels in addition to growing more oilseed crops, which will be covered in more detail at the AOCS meeting in May. But anyway, you look at it, a future entirely free of fossil fuel is going to be a challenge to reach. The cost of petroleum is currently around $63 a barrel, which is nearly $500 per metric ton. Vegetable oil, on the other hand, costs about twice as much, making it uneconomic to use as a fuel without subsidies and tax breaks. Of course, this situation could change, and current reserves of petroleum have been estimated by BP as being able to last about 50 years. But I remember hearing in the 70s that petroleum production would peak around the year 2000, which didn't happen. There have been a few bumps in the curve, but a steady downturn is yet to be seen, and I wouldn't be surprised if over the next 50 years, the presence of much more oil will be revealed. The biofuels industry has naturally turned to cheap sources of oil, such as used cooking oil, also known as UCO. At home, and this is genuinely what we've done, we've only managed to collect less than a litre per person over the past year and a half, as shown by this plastic bottle, which by itself won't get us very far. In the same period, I've used around 1,000 litres of diesel in my car. A study by the European Biomass Industry Association showed that the potential supply, including restaurants and food industry, is about 8 litres per person per year in the EU. But in 2007, only just over 1 litre per person per year was being recovered. More is coming onto the market, but demand is rising quicker than supply. And one of the consequences is that UCO is not only becoming more difficult to find, but it's also being adulterated with other low-grade oils, forcing the industry to have to work with oil that is often very variable in quality and difficult to process. We will look at ways to deal with these very poor quality feedstocks, which are often being seen these days, at the AOCS meeting in May. This chart shows how the share of biofuels for road transport varies in different countries. On a world level, this was only 3.3% in 2011, and not only includes fuel made from natural oils and fats, but also sources such as corn and sugarcane. In 2017, the figure had risen to 3.8%, and although this is not a big part of a total, it's nearly 80 million tonnes of oil, which is equivalent to about a third of a global market in vegetable and animal oils and fats, making it a significant industry. And you'll see this is only road transport, and at the moment air travel and shipping barely feature in these numbers. The amount of farmland in the world was 4.9 billion hectares, or 49 million square kilometres in 2011. Palm oil manages to supply over a third of the world's vegetable oil using only 0.3% of agricultural land. And all the other major oilseeds are only using about 5%, about half of which is planted with soybeans. So soybeans are using about 2.5% of the world's agricultural land. Some campaigners give the impression that oil palms and soybeans are taking over the world, but in fact their global impact is not that great. Perhaps the most startling thing about this chart is that over 70% of farmland is being used for raising animals, including grazing and land for growing crops, such as grain to feed the animals. If we look at the wider picture, the latest figures show that 50% of the world's habitable land, that's not including Antarctica and the mountaintops and the deserts, etc., is used for farming. 37% is forest, and 11% is described as shrubs, some of which might be suitable for farming or reforestation. Built-up areas and inland water only account for about 1% each. And I find that quite surprising, really, that towns and cities are so small, and there's 37 times more forest than towns and cities. The population of the world is likely to rise by about 25% by 2050. It's theoretically possible to feed all those extra people and grow more oil crops for biofuels on existing farming land. Soybeans are a very efficient source of protein, and if only a small part of a land that used to be tropical rainforest was used for growing palm oil, then the amount of oil available for making biofuels would be increased by a very substantial amount. But in practice, farming will most likely to continue to put pressure on forests and other areas of natural vegetation, and farmers have to make a living just like everyone else. Fortunately, there are a range of materials that can be turned into biofuels. Agricultural and forestry wastes and byproducts can provide what is known as lignocellulosic biomass. There are billions of tons per year of this stuff produced in the world, although collecting enough into one place to process it can be a problem. Microbes, non-edible crops grown on marginal land, and industrial byproducts can add to the oil produced from edible material. And in the AOCS meeting in May, we shall be covering alternative feedstocks, including the use of yeast found on rotten wood in the Chilean rainforest to produce biodiesel. So to sum up, air trapped in polar ice shows a strong link between atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature. The increasing use of fossil fuels has led to increasing carbon dioxide levels and increasing temperatures since the beginning of the 20th century. All parts of the economy are making a significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, so there is scope for making reductions in all areas of our lives. In vegetable oil processing, large energy savings are often possible with a good return on investment, and other industries have to do likewise. Renewable fuels, including biofuels, are increasing and will be a necessary part of reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Rising populations will limit the amount of land that can be used for growing fuel crops, but new sources of biofuels are being developed, which will be discussed in more detail at the AOCS online meeting in May. Thank you.
Excellent, Alan. Well, thank you for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. We have several questions kind of hinting at the food versus fuel debate. And I know you teased us with some upcoming presentations at the AOCS online meeting. But could you expand a little bit on how we reconcile the need for human food, the relative costs of current vegetable oil stocks relative to the cost of petroleum, and how we might grow in those 50 years after the next 50 to move away from petroleum?
Well, I mean, if petroleum is genuinely in short supply and is going to run out in 50 years, which sometimes you doubt, you think, well, yeah, they're just not telling us. But you could expect that as oil becomes a more marginal, more difficult to get, the price will rise. And one of the points I'm making here is that, in fact, palm oil and other oil seeds aren't occupying a very large part of the land that we're using. So you see that palm oil there, which is providing 30% of a current vegetable oil in the world, is only using 0.3% of the land. It's a very efficient oil producer. And so long as you could get hold of land that used to be, was cleared for something else years ago and is there, and there's quite a lot of that land around, sometimes not doing anything, sometimes being used for something else. But if you could get hold of that land, and I say that's not necessarily very easy, you wouldn't need that much to make a very significant contribution. And you could say, well, look, you could, some of the land that's being used for animal farming could be diverted. And I know this is a bit of an elephant in the room, but if you say, well, some land that is being used for animals is grazing, you couldn't use it for much else. But there is land that's being used for growing plants to feed to animals, that if they were used for growing plants to feed to people, you'd be able to sort of fill the gap, the food gap, without chopping down any more forest to make any more farmland, which is clearly, I think, something that people don't want to see. So it is a delicate balance, and you can easily get unintended consequences. Someone says, "Oh, we'll put a subsidy so you grow this instead of that." Somebody, and as soon as you do that, someone's coming along and they're exploiting the system because it's making them more money. And they're not doing it necessarily, for the good of humanity. They're doing it because, they're just playing the system, and that's what happens, of course. But it is a difficult problem. I mean, I do recognise that, the best thing to do is, if you can make fuel out of non-edible parts of the non-edible parts of the plant, the straw and the empty palm bunches and the bits of the soybean plant that aren't soybeans, what you call that, but all that stuff, that's clearly better than making oil, making fuel out of soybeans and corn and all the other things you could actually eat.
Okay. And actually, a related question just came into the queue, so I'll put this one on the top here. When we talk in the vegetable oil industry, we default to soybean and palm because they're the biggest feedstocks. Are there other vegetable oils that have utility in biodiesel or biofuels? Are there particular oils that perform better than others? Are there oils that are more optimal for the environment from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's
If we were going to
surprising
use them.
such a small number of crops where dominate the industry, and that so 85% of the oil produced at the moment comes from only 4 crops, which is palm, soy, sunflower, and rapeseed / canola. But you do hear of some others. I mean, there was a lot of talk about jatropha a few years ago. It seems to have died down a bit. I'm now hearing a lot about a Brazilian palm tree called macoba or something like that. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. But what they're saying about that is that if you grow that, you can also grow kind of semi-wild land around it and in between it, and it would be a way of sort of reforesting areas, harvesting the nuts, which have quite a high oil content. It's not quite as good as palm oil from that point of view, but it's getting up there, a major oil producer, and you could produce edible oil, you could produce fuel, and you also kind of rehabilitate the land to the same degree, to some degree. And this is what's being claimed. I haven't seen it in detail, but certainly there are investigations of this type going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and here's another one on that topic. Have you heard anything about the use of moringa oil?
No,
I believe that's a hyoleic stock.
Oh yes, no, I don't know about that for a few. I know there's a number of plants particularly tropical plants being investigated for this Brazilian one I've heard of, and I know there are others, but I don't know of the full detail of all the particular types.
Okay. Well, we'll kind of pivot here because there's obviously some interface between the vegetable oil industry in the world and governments, right? Governments and international organizations like the UN have really driven a lot of the adoption of biofuels and a movement towards a more sustainable energy system. Can you comment at all on what role the vegetable oil industry will play in meeting the low carbon fuel standard here in the US or other analogous regulatory regimes that might exist in Europe or around the world?
Well, I think the certainly part of the problem is that the current production of vegetable oil is only very small compared to the amount of petroleum being produced. And if you're going to produce 300 million tons a year of fuel for aircraft, never mind anything else, that's using 1.5 times the global production of vegetable oil at the current time. So it's quite a different. It doesn't. You say, well, it looks good. You say, well, look, I've got some oil. I can easily make it into diesel or jet fuel or something, but there's a relatively small amount of it. Palm oil, because it's a very high yielding plant, does have the potential to produce quite a lot of oil on relatively little land, but you can't go cutting down the rainforest to do it, otherwise you've defeated the object of the exercise. So it only works if you can select degraded land that wasn't really being used for anything productive and put that back into palm oil. Then you might start getting somewhere. Soybean, I mean, it's a relatively low yielding from an oil point of view, and very often the main reason for growing soybean is because of its potential as a protein producer. So soybean is producing, relatively low levels of oil. And okay, if you can get some oil, off the back of what else soybean is doing, all well and good. But soybean on its own is a difficult crop to get very large amounts of oil out of, because its main focus as a crop is the protein it produces.
Okay, so a question about evolving technology, and I think this is really apt because we've only been dealing with transgenic crops for a matter of decades. So a question here that asks, are you aware of technology to engineer the synthesis and accumulation of large amounts of oil in crop biomass rather than in seeds or fruits? What do you think of the potential? This kind of reminds me of the potential use of algae in this space.
Well, yeah, so algae is difficult. One of the things that you can do now is you can look at the genome of plants. I remember seeing something about palm oil, but other seeds that this can apply to as well. And you can take, once you've got like a seed, you don't have to grow it to know what it's going to do. You can plant, you can analyze it genetically and say, well, this palm oil or this whatever it is, it'll yield so many tons of oil per hectare, and it'll produce so much biomass. And then okay, you can grow it and test it, but they've managed to get to a state now where the ability to predict this sort of thing is remarkably good. So you can breed, and then you can also look at the genetic potential. Now with palm oil, the current average is maybe 5 tons of oil per hectare per year. But the people who study the genetics say, well, if we really tweaked it to the ultimate, we could get maybe 19 tons, or maybe 3 times as much as we currently do. So there is a lot of potential for tweaking the genetics of these things. Now, I know that some people don't like that, but that's a reality. That is something you could do. You can look at these crops and say, look, this plant will get so much oil, or get so much biomass, or lignocellulosic biomass that we talked about. It'll sequester so much carbon, and here's what we can do to make it better. And and I think that is a very promising development.
Okay. A broad question here. Do you regard vegetable oils as a sustainable feedstock given their current high cost and availability?
Well, I think they're sustainable. I mean, I don't think it can completely fill the gap, but it's sustainable as far as it goes. So it's something that you can produce in a sustainable way. You can have an area where you grow it, and you can whatever byproducts you've got, you can bury them in compost the leftovers to improve the soil, or you can ferment them to make methane and use that to drive a power station. So yeah, it is, you can imagine a long-term sustainable system. But edible oil in itself, vegetable oil in itself, probably can't it won't be able to fully fill the gap between what we currently do and replacing petroleum. We had to look at other things, such as other forms of biomass, other forms of forestry and agricultural waste that could be processed into fuels. But oils themselves, I think, yes, absolutely sustainable.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm going to pivot. You've got a long career in engineering and can run mass balances and energy balances. Do you think the oilseed industry has a role to play more broadly as an advocate for things like palm to shift this public dialogue away from palm being, a terrible thing for the planet? How can we become advocates more to show people that vegetable oils are sustainable, that they can help with a lower carbon future? I lived in Cincinnati for a long time, and I remember the Greenpeace banners being unfurled on the Procter and Gamble towers. So,
mm.
palm is not a well-liked thing in the broader public sometimes.
Well, I think, I mean, like anything, it has been, the palm oil industry has been responsible for some unsympathetic developments. You say, well, you can always find some, but there is a way to manage it that is using land that hasn't been freshly cut from the rainforest. I mean, maybe people are still doing that, but it's not necessarily not necessary to do that. There is land available. Okay, sometimes it's not land as easy to use. And there's a big study done in Indonesia, which identified, I think it was in 9 million hectares or something like this. A very large amount of land in Indonesia that could be developed for palm oil that was currently not really being used for very much. Almost idle land. But some of it was in areas quite difficult to get to, so it was more tempting to sort of go in and, next door, here's some forest, we'll cut that down, but palm oil can be captured and regulated in such a way that you could say that this is a sustainable thing. We've even helped redevelop part of the forest. We've allowed, one of the things they're looking at in Malaysia is allowing the areas next to rivers to sort of become rewilded, so that you would have a sort of wild zone of natural vegetation next to rivers. So any fertilizer runoff would go into the natural forest. You'd still have a reservoir for wildlife. So it can be done. I mean, I understand why people have objected to it, but it doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so much of it is, there's a lot of public debate and kind of influence of consumers. I work in the beauty industry, so we're familiar with some of that messaging. A follow up from the earlier question about engineering oil into tissues. So this has apparently been demonstrated by what looks like a government research entity in Australia. I'm going to guess it's CSIRO, but the acronym is CSIRO. And what
Yeah.
they've been able to do is yield basically an energy biomass crop. So there's going to be 25% oil by biomass, which is not particularly striking for an oil seed in and of itself, but this is apparently the whole plant. So they've demonstrated it in tobacco, sugarcane, and sorghum, where you have oil in leaves and stems, which very interesting tech. I mean, obviously, this is an engineering question. Do you think we could work with that type of a matrix to generate vegetable oil in a meaningful way? That's obviously more of an extraction question.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, all plant cells. I mean, I remember from my biology at school, all plant cells contain some oil. So there's like
Mm-hmm.
droplets of oil in. No, there's probably now someone will tell me there's one that doesn't, but basically all plant cells have oil in them, so that you could by genetic manipulation increase that amount, and I don't see any obvious reason why that that couldn't you couldn't squeeze the oil out by some means or other. But also the biomass itself can then be converted into fuel. The actual all the what they call lignocellulosic biomass in what we talked about, that can be fermented. I mean, you've got these yeasts that can break down woody material. You've got the cellulose material that can be broken down by other things. There's a whole range of microorganisms that can chow down on the woody and sugary part of the plant, as well as the oil itself.
Excellent. So, along those lines, do you see the potential for research within organizations like AOCS or government organizations to explore things beyond just the oil-bearing bodies in the crops that we're familiar with?
Oh, so sure there is, and there's a very large amount of this sort of material, and one of the problems I think, which I did hint at, is that sometimes getting enough of it together to make it worthwhile dealing with. So that's a sort of logistical problem that has to be addressed. I remember years ago I was working for a company that was in Africa, and there was a lot of sawmills around in the vicinity, and they thought, look, if we could collect the sawdust from these sawmills and we could burn it in our boilers and we could save some money by doing it. But they discovered that collecting it was actually so difficult that it wasn't really worth changing from what they were doing. And this is, this is part of the problem. I mean, it can be expensive as well. I mean, I was talking to someone in Argentina who had a sunflower husk boiler. So he was dehulling the sunflowers and burning the sunflower hulls, and he was getting a lot of energy. All his steam was coming from this. But the boiler itself was very, very expensive in the first place. Now, he was getting a return on investment, and it was a worthwhile thing to do, but it was a bit of a sort of financial effort to take the leap to do it.
Yep. Okay. Well, we're coming up on the allotted time. There's likely time for one more question, but I have nothing in the queue. If anyone in the audience wants to submit a
one
question.
that Amy had. There was the question that was on LinkedIn.
Yep, those were, one was food versus fuel, and one was that low carbon fuel standard.
Oh, so that's been covered.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. I mean, I don't really know quite what the future's going to bring. There's a lot of things going on, some of which you think might see some fruition if you look at various types of genetic engineering, growing various types of crops. But you say, well, we've got to do something, and probably something will emerge that we haven't really thought of yet. And I think by the time 2050 comes, we'll look back. If we could look back to today and say, well, he got some things right, but he completely overlooked something else, and that there'll be something in 2050 that we'll know about that we haven't really imagined yet.
Yep. We'll just leave that to you in your retirement, Alan. You just have to go out and invent it.
I'll be 95 in the year 2050, so I mean, I'm not even sure I'm going to get there. But my children could live well into the second part of this century, and my grandchildren, who are only born in 2016 and 2018, could easily live to the year 2100. And you do wonder about what the world will be like then.
Nope, it's that notion of intergenerational, responsibility.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Mike, for your questions or fielding the questions, and thanks everyone for attending. And say there will be available on the AOCS website a full transcript of what I've been saying. So if you didn't catch anything, it will be possible to look at it again afterwards.